Okay, I guess we're kind of close here, and we were going to have to try to keep this time constraints running tight today. My name's Ron. I'm an alcoholic. How you doing? Welcome. This is our first ever Doylestown one-day convention. Next year, we're planning on putting it in a much bigger venue, so we can get more people. We're expecting like 2 million people here today. You know, that's AA. 2 million tell you they're going to come out, and you're lucky you get 6, right? But anyway, I think we got an amazing amount of food. It's going to be a lot of fun, and I want to thank you guys for joining us early, because a lot of people have a hard time, waking up. I got a lot of people call me, like my other guy won't wake up, But as this day goes on, I think you're going to have a good thing. Bill's going to come up here, and he's going to kick this off with some great AA history. I'm going to have to adjust these lights. He wants a little darkness, because he does have that great projection system there, and it's a little hard to see with the lights on. So relax, have fun. And try to, there is one thing, we're not allowed to smoke anywhere on church property, so we got to kind of go across the street or over to that Dairy Queen, that's the only thing they ask, They give us the use of this $10 million church, and they say, Ron, please get you and your good friends not to smoke on it. That's pretty easy. So please try to be respectful of the church, and here's Bill. Bill, you about ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome, Bill.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Bill. I'm an alcoholic. Welcome to early morning show and tell. It's not a good sign when I haven't even started talking yet. My voice is shot already, so it should be interesting. This is my sexy DJ voice. Welcome to the first annual December to Remember in November. What the hell's that? December to Remember? It's November, dude. It's November 25th. So I'm going to talk about AA history, and you guys have an exceptional lineup of people for this weekend, so this should be really good. I always like starting by saying that just pretty much randomly, I just started getting into AA history. I went up to Stepping Stones in Bedford Hills, New York, which is up by Katona, New York. And I saw Bill's house and a whole lot of pictures of all the people that I had heard about. And it just blew my mind. And ever since then, I sort of can't shut it off. I'm just heavily into AA history. It's just a passion that I've had for 25 years, and I really love it. And the thing that I always recommend, if you want to get into AA history, there's one suggestion that I give to you, and that is, as you're reading AA history and as you're learning about AA history, you'll begin to notice like 100 coincidences, otherwise known as God, running through the whole entire thing, because these people that created AA were not capable of doing what they did. So these people that started AA were no better than you and I, and some of them were not as good as you and I. So they were not capable of doing what they did. It's really an amazing story. It's really an amazing event, and it seems like a lot of other groups that tried to deal with alcoholism, it never went past the generation of the people that started it. But AA is still here, and it started back in, Bill got sober on December 11th, 1934, and it's 2017, and it's still strong, and it's still affecting people in a really strong way. So if you're new, welcome to AA, and welcome to my show and tell. I want to start with this. These are all the key players of the start of AA. You have Charlie Towns. The Towns Hospital is where Bill got sober, Bill got sobered up for the last time, and where Dr. Silkworth worked. Dr. Silkworth was the guy that was drying up all of the drunks in New York and New Jersey, and also had a big part in the doctor's opinion in the front of the big book. Frank Bookman is the guy that started the Oxford group. AA came from the Oxford group, so we owe a great debt of gratitude to Frank Bookman, because his movement was where AA came from. Dr. Bob was one of the co-founders. Ann Ripley Smith was his wife. Roland Hazard was the one that carried the message to Ebbie. Ebbie carried the message to Bill, and Bill carried the message to Bob, and Bill and Bob were our co-founders. So it really started with Roland. And then Henrietta Seiberling, it was in her house that Bill and Bob met for the first time in Akron, Ohio. Sister Ignatia was a non-alcoholic nun that worked in Akron with Dr. Bob to help. They used to call it fixing the drunks. That's what they called it, fixing the drunks. And Sister Ignatia was a big part of that. She handled the alcoholic ward in Akron City Hospital and helped Dr. Bob. If it wasn't for her, she was the administration person. So if it wasn't for her, we would have never got the drunks into the hospital in the first place. So she had a really warm place in her heart. She was Irish, so I'm sure there was alcoholism in her family, because I think every family has alcoholism if you're Irish. She was the non-alcoholic nun that really helped a lot of drunks with Dr. Bob in Akron. And then Lois was Bill W.'s wife. Sam Shoemaker was Bill's first spiritual advisor, and he was the one that ran basically the headquarters of the Oxford Group in the early 30s in New York City. And then Bill W. was one of our co-founders. He's sort of the man. And then Harry Tebow was a psychiatrist that was one of the first doctors to risk his career by saying that AA was a good thing and that it should be supported. And then Ebbie T. was the one that carried the message to Bill W. So these are the sort of the main characters and when they were born. The interesting thing about AA is that Roland Hazard, his family had a summer home in Vermont. Dr. Bob, he grew up in Vermont. Bill W. grew up in Vermont. Ebbie T. had a summer home in Vermont. Lois W., they had a summer home in Vermont. For some reason, all the key players, they didn't know each other, but all the key players basically had some kind of involvement in Vermont, and it's just some kind of weird coincidence. Now here's a picture of Bill W. when he was really small with his grandmother. I love this picture because it looks like Bill has a thought. This is the Wilson house. This is one of the earliest pictures of the Wilson's house I was able to find. It's so early that the roads are still dirt. And that's the Wilson house on the left. Not the one straight ahead, but on the left where you see the side of the porch. And then this is the front of the Wilson house. This is sort of how it looks now. It's bright red. It's basically a rooming home. It's a rooming house. It's a bed and breakfast. And then the back of it is this big room, and they have conferences there many weekends. They hold about 100 people, and I highly recommend that you go to the Wilson house if you haven't gone. Go check it out. It's a really wonderful opportunity. That's where Bill Wilson was born, actually. And then that's the front of the house on the left, and that's the back of the house on the right where they have retreats and stuff. It's interesting, the front part of the house on the left was a bar. And behind the bar there was a room. And that was where Bill was born. So Bill was literally born behind a bar, which is almost totally appropriate, right? Now this is the Griffith house. If you're looking at the Wilson house from the front, to the left there's a field, and on the far side of the field is a church. And then to the left of that is the Griffith house, and that's where Bill W.'s grandfather lived. His grandfather and his grandmother. And when he was about 7 or 8 years old, about a year earlier, his father left on a business trip and never came back. And then about a year later, Bill's mom decided, this single parenting thing isn't for me. I'm going to go become a doctor. And she leaves and she goes to Boston. So Bill and his younger sister Dorothy are literally abandoned by their parents. And next door is their grandparents, and that's who raised Bill, really. And his grandparents were very good to him. It was very good, living with them and stuff like that. But as far as I'm concerned, this is sort of the first traumatic experience that Bill had. I mean, I can't imagine his parents leaving it, was a happy-go-lucky kind of an event for him. But this is where Bill lived from ages 7 until, he left to go to war. This is a picture of Bill's mom. I think that was when she was graduating from being a doctor. Another picture of Bill's mom. This is kind of a cool picture. This is my favorite picture of Bill's mom. It's just very sophisticating. And then this is the only picture of Bill's dad. Now, Bill's dad, Gilman, There's some indication that he might have been an alcoholic, but we're really not too sure. But I mean, he went on a business trip and didn't come home. You know what I mean? Like it's. And this is Bill's grandfather. The interesting thing about Bill's grandfather and Bill's family is that the town of East Dorset, Vermont, back in the early 1900s, was a very rough and tumble kind of a town. You know, if you stopped, the train would stop in town, and if you were getting off the train there, the conductor would warn you about the bad neighborhood, basically. It was a really rough place. It was sort of like a biker town. And, you know, lots of drunkenness and lots of fights. And the king of the drunks and the king of the fighters was Bill's grandfather. And one day on a Sunday morning, if you've ever been to the Wilson house, it's surrounded by these small mountains. And one day he decided to go for a walk. I'm sure he was probably hungover and, you know, he's trying to walk it off, basically. And he goes for a walk up one of the mountains, and he has this white light spiritual experience. He becomes this really wonderful person, and he never drinks again. And then he comes down from that mountain, and he crosses the field next door to the Wilson house in front of the church. He goes into the church, and the minister at the church was just finishing their sermon. And Bill's grandfather gets up on the podium and describes to the entire congregation about what had just happened to him up on the mountain. He had a white light spiritual experience. So not only was alcoholism in Bill's family, but spiritual awakenings were in Bill's family also, which is kind of an interesting combination there. This is Bill at a young age. It's kind of a cool picture, right? This is the kind of pictures they took in those days. Here's Bill with the perfect hair, age 10. This is Bill and his younger sister, Dorothy. And then Bill goes to school at Burr and Burton. And there's a couple things that happened at Burr and Burton that were really significant. One, he meets Ebbie T for the first time. And him and Ebbie T become fast friends. Ebbie lived in Manchester, just a couple blocks from Burr and Burton. And Bill was in East Dorset. You know, it's like maybe a 5-minute ride in a car. And he would get on the train, and the train would stop in Manchester. And then he would walk up to Burr and Burton. Also at Burr and Burton, Bill meets his first girlfriend, Bertha Bamford. This is Bill's main squeeze. And, you know, Bill was sort of an uncomfortable kind of a kid. And, you know, I can really relate to that. I was a very uncomfortable kind of kid. I was sort of socially awkward. And Bill was very socially awkward. He was very tall. He was very lanky. He was sort of had strange habits and ways about him. And he wasn't really very comfortable going to school. And he wasn't really that comfortable with the people that lived near him. And for the first time, he gets a girlfriend. So for the first time, he feels comfortable and he feels really satisfied in his life. You know, he has that first glow of the first relationship. You know what I mean? And in a really short period of time, she goes to New York City for a pretty minor operation, and she ends up dying. And this is when Bill's depression started. He was so depressed that he couldn't go to school for months. He just stayed in his bed. He never left his house. He never went to school. He never went out. He was devastated. And this is when Bill's depressions began. This is Lois's parents. Lois also lived down the street from Ebbie in Manchester. That was their summer home. Here's a picture of Lois when she was a small child. You can tell by this picture she's so spiritual that she hovers off the ground. I have no idea what's going on there. Either she's hovering off the ground or she's laying down or something. I don't know what's going on. And here's a picture of Lois on a small horse. And this is the actual place, Emerald Lake, where Bill and Lois met for the first time. Now, there's some indication that Bill's sister and Lois's brother dated for a short period of time. So that might be when they met each other. Lois was the older woman. She was more than a few years older than Bill. And this is where they met, at Emerald Lake. Maybe about 3 or 4 miles down the street from the Wilson house. Here's a picture of Lois, second from the left. I always like joking that they played for a 12-step basketball team. Obviously, there are no 12 steps at this point in history, but it's kind of a funny joke. Here's Bill and Lois in their graduation garb. Like I said, Bill met his first girlfriend when they were seniors at Burr & Burton. Bill was the class president, and Bertha was the class treasurer. So it's more than likely that that was where they I almost said hooked up, because I don't think that's appropriate. That was where they probably started talking more, was, at the school council or whatever. And, but Bill stopped going to school for a long period of time. He couldn't leave his house. He was so depressed when Bertha died, it was devastated. And then he ended up going back and taking some classes, and he ended up passing, and he graduated, but not with his class. It was like a year after his class he graduated. And here's Lois on the left in her wedding gown. This wasn't the day of their wedding, but that's a picture of Lois in her wedding gown. And then I always like saying that that's Bill and Lois on the right, lost in the woods. And here's, after Bill leaves Burr & Burton, he goes to Norwich University. And this is Bill's band. That's Bill on the back on the right, with the very large forehead. And Bill was kind of a unique guy. He literally had a very, very strong willpower. And if he wanted to do something, he would just will it to happen. And he always wanted to play an instrument, so one day he picked up a violin and just started playing it and became really good. He never took any lessons or anything. He just willed himself to be really good at playing violin. As a matter of fact, I even have a recording of him playing the violin, and he was really good. And then one day when he was at Burr & Burton, he was out back on the side, and there was a baseball field there. And it was like during gym or during lunchtime or whatever, and he was playing first base, and he wasn't paying attention, and somebody threw the ball to him and hit him in the head and knocked him over and knocked him out. And he got really embarrassed by the whole thing. And everybody kind of laughed at him because he really wasn't very good at baseball. And one day he said, right after that, when he got hit in the head, he said, you know what? Within a year, I'm going to be captain of the baseball team. And he did it. He just willed himself to become a really great baseball player. Really kind of interesting. Now, this is really important later because he tried to will himself to stop drinking and he wasn't able to do it. So, he had a strong willpower, but, willpower has its limitations, especially when we're dealing with addiction. And here's Bill in his uniform during World War I. And then he comes home from World War I. He starts to become a lawyer, and then he decides that that's not for me, I don't want to do that. And he gets really interested in the stock market. And he comes up with this really, really great theory that if he goes out to businesses and talks to the company and finds out if the company is strong, and if the company is growing, and if the company is, creating and growing and stuff like that, that would be good information for the stock market, because then you would want to get that stock. So he went to Wall Street and he said, I want to go out and check out these companies and let you know whether they're strong or not. And the stock market was very, very strong at the time, so people thought it was just a waste of time because they were making lots and lots of money, so it just wasn't necessary. And but Bill went and did it anyway. So Bill and Lois got some tent and a motorcycle and just started going up and down the East Coast to all the major corporations and surveyed, whether they were worth investing in or not. And he made a lot of money because of it. For some reason, for me, this is really important. The motorcycle was a Harley Davidson. For me, that's very important. I always say that friends don't let friends drive rice burners. So that's just my thing. And here's Lois. Now here's a picture of the side of the motorcycle. So you have the motorcycle and then you have a sidecar, right? Because they had a tent and all kinds of stuff. Now, what's little known is that Bill never liked driving the motorcycle, so usually Lois drove it, which is, we're talking about the 1920s, 1930s. This is very unusual, you know what I mean? So Lois would be driving, and Bill was really tall and he had really long legs. So he would sit in the sidecar with his legs over the top of the sidecar because he wasn't comfortable if he put his legs into the sidecar. So I can only imagine what people thought, you know, like this motorcycle comes through, the woman's driving, the guy's like hanging half out, like who are these people, you know? Now, Frank Bookman, I said earlier, he was the one that started the Oxford Group, or what became the Oxford Group. This is the guy that you and I owe our life to. This is the guy where AA came from, his movement. And if you read Oxford Group literature, and if you read Oxford Group articles, you'll see AA all over it. Now, the Oxford Group didn't come from AA, AA came from the Oxford Group. But the Oxford Group originally was called a First Century Christian Fellowship. And basically what they tried to do was they tried to reenact what it must have been like in the early days of Christ followers before the church started, where it was just a bunch of people that went around spreading the good news. There was no church, there was no gospel, there was no churchianity yet. It was just Christianity. And it was just a word of mouth kind of a thing. And the Oxford Group, or what, you know, Frank Bookman did was, you know, they went around one-on-one. At first it was basically one-on-one. And Frank was one of those guys, he could sit down with you and have a 15-minute conversation and completely change your life. Just a completely wonderful guy. He wasn't a great public speaker, he didn't like public speaking. But he did have a real skill in working one-on-one to help others. By the way, like you saw here, he was actually nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. He didn't win, but he was nominated by whole countries. As a matter of fact, Martin Luther King Jr. nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. It's like this guy was a life changer in a really big way. Another picture of Frank. Now this is an example of one of their gatherings. This is July 1939 at the Hollywood Bowl, just outside of LA in California. This place holds 30,000 people. 15,000 people were turned away. This was just an outdoor house party where they had speakers and then they had people working one-on-one. And for those of you that are familiar with the Oxford Group, you see the four beams of light that shine up into the sky. Each one of the beams of light represents the four absolutes. Absolute love, absolute purity, absolute honesty, and absolute unselfishness, which was a big part of the Oxford Group. And where they got that from was the Sermon on the Mount. Now, in the late 30s, they started in the mid-20s, and they were basically referred to as a First Century Christian Fellowship. And then in the 20s, they were in Oxford, England, and they took a trip to Africa. And in those days, when you were on a ship or when you were on a train, when you went from one place to another, all your luggage would be stamped with where you came from. So all their luggage said Oxford on it. So everybody started calling them, oh, that's that Oxford Group. And it just became a nickname. It wasn't their official name, it just became a nickname and it sort of stuck. So they were referred to as the Oxford Group. And then in the late 1930s, they decided, you know, we never really picked an official name. And World War II was getting started, and everybody was talking about, you know, rearming weapons and stuff like that. And what Frank said and what the Oxford Group said was, you know, we don't need an armament, we don't need a rearmament militarily, what we need is a moral rearmament. So that was what they officially called their fellowship now. So this is when they officially sort of had a name instead of the nickname, the Oxford Group. Back in 2001, they changed the name to Initiatives of Change. They're still in existence today. They're very different than how they used to be in the early days, but the movement still exists now. The headquarters is in Switzerland, and they're still alive and well. Here's a picture of a young Bill, 1930. This is when he was still drinking. They moved to 182 Clinton Street in Brooklyn. Now, this is where Bill and Lois lived toward the end of Bill's drinking and toward the beginning of his sobriety. So this is where they lived. It's still there. Maybe about 10 years ago, the house was up for sale. So some of us got to go into the house and see what the house looked like, and there were pictures, like the realtor pictures and stuff like that, so you could actually see what it looked like on the inside. It was basically, all the floors. I think it's like 3 or 4 floors or something like that. The whole, like half of the building. It's a pretty large place. Now, the guy on the left is Roland Hazard, and the guy on the right is Carl Jung. Roland Hazard came from a really rich family in Rhode Island. As a matter of fact, a month ago I was up in Narragansett, Rhode Island, and that's where he's buried. And that's where his family was from. And they have a Hazard archive and stuff like that at the library. They were really influential and really big in the area. And Roland had a serious drinking problem. Now, since he was so rich, he could do anything to deal with that alcoholism problem. And at the time, there was 3 psychiatrists, 3 major contributors to psychiatric thought that still influence psychiatry today. And the 3 major psychiatrists were Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and Alfred Adler. The interesting thing about Carl Jung and Alfred Adler were both of them were students of Sigmund Freud. Now, notice the coincidence here. Sigmund Freud, no concept of a higher power. Alfred Adler, no concept of a higher power. Carl Jung, huge influence and huge belief in a higher power. And his belief in the higher power influenced his teachings and influenced his work. And when Roland Hazard could choose who he could go see to deal with his alcoholism, he went to Sigmund Freud, and Sigmund Freud had cancer and he wasn't taking on any more patients. And he went to Alfred Adler, and Alfred Adler was too busy and he wasn't taking on any more patients. So he goes to Carl Jung. Now, what kind of a coincidence is that Roland Hazard ends up getting a solution, otherwise known as a higher power? If he had gone to the other 2 psychiatrists, he would have never heard that message. He was with Carl Jung for a period of time, less than a year. And he's traveling back to the United States, and he passed through France on the way to get to the ocean liner to come back to America. And somebody asked him the wrong question. Would you like a drink? And he said yes, and he got drunk, and he couldn't understand. I've been with this great psychiatrist. I thought my problem was cured. What happened? And he goes back to Carl Jung, and he's like, what's the deal? Now, I would like to suggest that this is a moment of divine intervention, because I don't know what some other psychiatrists would have done. It's very possible that he would have just become heavily medicated. It's very possible that some other psychiatrist would have just strung him along for a bunch of years because he was a very rich man. But Carl Jung didn't do that. Carl Jung said to Roland Hazard, listen, I wasn't sure if you were an alcoholic or not. Now I know you are. There's nothing I can do for you. This great power, this great human resource slams the door in his face and says, sorry, I can't help you. I don't know anybody that's ever helped an alcoholic. Have a nice day. And Roland says, wait, come on. Come on. No one's ever been able to help an alcoholic. And Carl Jung says, yeah, but here and there throughout history, these people occasionally have these spiritual experiences and they never drink again. But I don't know how to bring that about, and nobody I know knows how to bring it about. And that's your only hope. Find some really extreme religious group, and maybe you'll have a spiritual experience. I can't help you with that. Have a nice day. And Roland Hazard comes back to America. But before he leaves, he says to Carl Jung, this is good news because I was really big in my church. And Carl Jung says, yeah, but I don't think that's going to work, because if it was going to work, it would have already. And Carl Jung comes back to America distraught and hopeless. And a distant cousin of his, Shep Cornell, who was a distant cousin of his, ends up having a conversation with him about the Oxford group. And Roland gets involved in the Oxford group, and as far as I can tell from all the research I've done, he never drinks again. And now he's really big on the Oxford group. The Oxford group just helped change his life. This is a picture of Roland on the left and his wife and his son on the right. Later this year, after this picture was taken, his son died in World War II. His son was a pilot, and he crashed and died within a short period after this picture was taken. Now, Roland and his cousin Shep Cornell and another gentleman, Seaver Graves, they're in the Vermont area. And they hear about this guy, Ebbie T., who has a really serious drinking problem and that he's in jail. And this is Ebbie T. In Vermont, they had this law that if you're arrested 3 times for drunkenness, no matter what the reason was, you were going to spend time in jail. And Ebbie had been arrested for the 3rd time, and he was sitting in a cell waiting to be sentenced, and he was going to be put in jail for a while. And these 2 gentlemen come to visit him in jail, Shep Cornell and Seaver Graves, and they say to him, we're with the Oxford group, and we have a cure for alcoholism. Would you like some help? And Ebbie's like, yeah, he's in jail. Like, you could have said anything to him and he would have agreed to it, you know what I mean? So they say to Ebbie, when is your sentencing date? Ebbie tells them. They leave and they come back with Roland Hazard. So now there's 3 of them in court with Ebbie while Ebbie's about to be sentenced. And Ebbie's name is called and he stands up. And Roland Hazard, who is better known of the 3 men, says to the judge, Your Honor, we're with the Oxford group and we have a cure for alcoholism. And we believe that this man is an alcoholic. And we would like to ask you to release him in our custody so we can give him the cure. And the judge says, yeah. Now the thing that you don't know is that, like I said, Seaver Graves, Shep Cornell, and Roland Hazard show up to help Ebbie. What you don't know is that Seaver Graves' father was the judge. And Seaver Graves, the Oxford group, had helped him with his alcoholism, so the judge knew that these people helped drunks. So he said, yeah, not a problem. I'll release him in your custody, but you need to get out of town real quick because the locals aren't going to appreciate me handling it this way. So these 4 men say, so we got to leave town, so what do you want to do? Like, where do you want to go? Well, they were getting involved in the Oxford group, and the Oxford group was helping their lives. And they were like, well, why don't we go to New York City? And that's where the Oxford Group headquarters is. And why don't we go learn some more about the Oxford Group and try to help them? So they leave Vermont and they go to New York City, where coincidentally, Bill W., Ebbie's school friend, has a heavy drinking problem and is drinking himself basically to death. So this is the series of coincidences and the movement toward the founders who started AA. This is Ebbie's house in Manchester, Vermont. Please do not ever go to this house. The people that live there do not like visitors. I actually went there once. Because I'm one of these guys, you know what I mean? Like, I'm like, I want in, you know what I mean? The good thing was that I knew not to go to this house. I knew that the people didn't like visitors. But I had some information. And I thought I would give it to them. And what I had was some really, really early information about how the house was built and when it was built, and a bunch of information and a bunch of pictures from the earliest days of this house. So when I went to the house, I went there under the guise of, I just want to give you more information about your house. So they actually were friendly to me, but I don't know anybody else they were friendly with. So you got to work it, you know what I mean? You got to work it. That's pretty much what I'm saying. This is Seaver Graves. He actually was an actor at one time. He looks very Tony Curtis here. And then this is Shep Cornell. And this is the guy that carried the message to Roland. And then Roland and Shep and Seaver carried the message to Ebbie. So they go to New York City to the Calvary Church. The Calvary Church is still there. This is where the headquarters of the Oxford Group was at the time. Sam Shoemaker was sort of the guy in charge. He was the minister there. This is Sam Shoemaker. Really, really wonderful guy. Another kind of life changer kind of guy. You know, you sit down and have a 15-minute conversation with this guy and your life is just different. These people are the kind of people that they can just like kind of pierce your soul in a really short conversation, you know what I mean? This is where the Calvary Mission was, part of the church, and this is, you know, the kind of room where Ebbie would have stayed when they came to visit New York City. And this is the main hall at the Calvary Church, and this is an actual Oxford Group meeting in 1932. I've been in this room. The picture was taken from the stage, so there's like a stage, and that's where the picture is taken from. And see those big, huge pictures in the background? All that stuff is still there. The room looks exactly the same today. And then here's a picture of Bill and Ebbie. Now, you know, the four men show up in New York City and they want to help the Oxford Group. And part of the Oxford Group deal was, you know, you have to go and find people to help. So Ebbie starts hearing about his school friend, Bill W., who has this major drinking problem and he's doing really, really bad. And there's some indication that Ebbie contacted Lois. And Ebbie and Lois basically set up Bill. It wasn't like a random thing when Ebbie called Bill that day, that fateful day. Lois told Ebbie, you know, on this day, at this time, Bill's going to be alone because I'm going to be at work. And this was back in the 30s when women didn't work. Bill was thoroughly embarrassed by the fact that his wife had to go to work and he couldn't handle it because he was such a drunk. And Ebbie says, you know, or Lois says, you know, call Bill on this day at this time. He'll be hungover and not doing very well, and nobody's going to be home. And Ebbie calls Bill, and the story's in the big book. And Bill's ecstatic. This is great. Like my school friend, I can drink with him. You know what I mean? Like I have an excuse to drink today instead of just randomly drinking, you know? He had something to look forward to that day, you know what I mean? So Ebbie comes over and Bill answers the door. And the first thing he notices is that Ebbie is fresh-skinned and glowing and that there's something about his eyes. He noticed that Ebbie is completely different and it's really obvious that he's doing really well. Now this is the table in the kitchen. This is the actual table. That white table there is the actual table that Bill and Ebbie sat at that very first 12-step call. Now, there were no 12 steps yet, but just let me use that phrase. You know, Ebbie comes to 12-step Bill, and that's the table. That's not the room. That's up at Stepping Stones in East Dorset, Vermont. But that table was at 182 Clinton Street. That's the actual table. As far as I'm concerned, that's the holy grail of AA. That's the actual table when Bill and Ebbie met for the first time that day in Brooklyn, when Ebbie carried the message to Bill of the Oxford Group. And for the first time in the history of mankind, the three parts of the solution for alcoholism that AA has to offer comes together. And Carl Jung carried the psychological and spiritual message to Roland Hazard, who carried that message to Ebbie, and then Ebbie brings that message to Bill. The Oxford Group shows Bill the spiritual solution, which ended up becoming the 12 steps. And then Dr. Silkworth, which will be coming into play soon, gives Bill the medical part of it, that as alcoholics, we have a craving for alcohol, and when we start drinking, we can't safely predict how far it's going to go. So for the first time in the history of humankind, all three parts of the puzzle land on Bill Wilson in his kitchen. And you know what? He's drunk. How cool is that? Now this is Dr. Leonard Strong on the left here. This was Bill's sister's husband, Dr. Leonard Strong. He was the one that paid for Bill's detoxes at Towns Hospital. And then on the right, that's Towns Hospital in New York City. It's right across the street from Central Park. I went there a few years ago, and I took a whole bunch of pictures. I went into New York City. Some people came from Iceland, and somebody gave them my contact information, And these people from Iceland that had never been to America before, they were members of AA, they came to America, they had never been to America before, and they contact me and they say, Bill, I heard that you do history tours of New York City in regard to AA, would you give us a tour of the town? And I was like, yeah, definitely, you know what I mean? So we ran around, I took pictures of everything, it was the first time that I took pictures of all the different places. And then when I got home, my wife had accidentally removed the memory chip and there were no pictures. You can't imagine how pissed I was. But this is Towns Hospital on the right. This is Bill's release form. Now, I have no idea who found this, but this is unbelievable. This is when Bill goes into the hospital. You notice over here it says December 11th, 1934. That's when he goes in. He's released on December 18th, 1934. He's there for a week. The whole thing cost $125. And you notice it says W.G. Wilson, William Griffith Wilson, 182 Clinton Street, Brooklyn. Unbelievable. I have no idea who found that. And then when Bill went to Towns Hospital that last time, he had gone to Towns Hospital, I would say more than a few times. He talks about 3 or 4 times, but I would like to suggest that it was probably more than that. And at Towns Hospital, the main guy in the alcohol and drug addiction ward is Dr. Silkworth. This short, very compassionate, very wonderful doctor. And I don't know about you, but I've had some experience with doctors, and I don't get the impression that when I'm talking to them, they're really listening to me. And if you're a doctor, I'm not insulting you, maybe you're the exception, but the doctors I've dealt with, they're really, really, really smart, and they don't really care about what I think about what's going on, you know what I mean? But Dr. Silkworth was one of those guys that, he was really genuine. He would sit down and he would really listen to you. He would really consider what you had to say. He was a good man. And he had this soft spot in his heart for drunks and for drug addicts. And he worked with lots and lots of them in New York City. And again, on the right there, that's the entrance into Towns Hospital. And Bill meets Dr. Silkworth. And, Bill has this, Ebbie comes to visit Bill, and basically, for the first time, Bill's somewhat interested in the message, because when Ebbie came to visit Bill at his house, Ebbie basically said to him, Bill's like, so you look like you're doing pretty well. What did you do to get free of alcoholism? And Ebbie's response, which I'm really happy this didn't happen to me, but this is what happened to Bill. Ebbie said, I've got religion. Now, I'm really happy somebody didn't do that to me, because I came from a religious family, and, no thanks, And that was Bill's response, no thanks. But he couldn't deny that something really wonderful was happening in Ebbie's life. It worked for Ebbie. Bill couldn't deny it. Bill considered Ebbie to be sort of intellectually inferior, and he also considered Ebbie to be a worse drunk than he was. Bill sort of looked down on Ebbie, basically. But Ebbie's sober, right? And Bill's trying to get sober and he's not able to do it. That must have driven Bill crazy. And Bill's last binge starts on November 11th, 1934, and he drinks for exactly 1 month. And on December 11th, 1934, he goes to the Towns Hospital for the last time, and he never drinks again. Ebbie comes to visit him, and Bill says, Ebbie, what was that Oxford Group solution again? And Ebbie goes over the 6 tenets of the Oxford Group, which later became the 12 steps. And Bill starts working the steps right in the hospital. He has a white light spiritual experience. He literally is in the hospital for 3 or 4 days. He's still slightly detoxing. He works what later became almost all of the 12 steps. He has a white light spiritual experience. He never drinks again. And after he has the white light spiritual experience, he's sitting in his room and he's just wondering what just happened. You know what I mean? For the first time in my life, I feel comfortable and I feel good and I feel okay. I feel one with everything. What happened? And Dr. Silkworth comes by. And since Dr. Silkworth was this wonderful kind of man that would genuinely listen to you when you talk to him, Bill tells Dr. Silkworth a story about what just happened to him. And Dr. Silkworth says, listen, I can't explain what happened to you, but you better hold on to it because it's a lot better than when you came in here. And Dr. Silkworth validates Bill's experience. He doesn't blow him off. And I would like to suggest once again that that was a point of divine intervention, because if Dr. Silkworth said, oh, you know, we gave you some drugs, you're probably hallucinating, just go to sleep, and blew it off, Bill would have never noticed the significance of what had happened to him. But because Dr. Silkworth was really listening and really saw something really important has happened, Dr. Silkworth co-signs and validates Bill's experience, and Bill sees that the importance of what just happened. And if it didn't happen that way, your and my sobriety hung in the balance, because it very easily could have not happened that way. And here's Charlie Towns. He's the guy that owned Towns Hospital. And then this is another picture of the front of Towns Hospital. And to be honest with you, I only show you this picture because I think that car is really cool. Does anybody have any idea which car it is? One time somebody told me what car it was, but I don't remember what they told me.
57 Chevy.
Yeah? Do you know what kind of Chevy? Yeah? I mean, you're pretty sure?
No.
Well, thanks for almost sharing. This is an advertisement for Towns Hospital. Notice it says drug addicts, alcoholics, and neurasthenics. I could never remember what neurasthenics was, so I had to write it down. It's nervousness due to overwork and mental strain. You know how we have the shakes, you know what I mean? We get the shakes from being so wasted. Now, I have to shift from the Bill W. track to the Dr. Bob track, because there's a couple tracks here, and both of these tracks are slowly starting to meet each other. This gentleman, Harvey Firestone, his family is Firestone Tire. They're very, very rich. Firestone Tire headquarters is in Akron, Ohio. And on a train, Harvey Firestone, probably hungover, serious alcohol problem, meets Sam Shoemaker and a bunch of other Oxford Group people that just coincidentally happened to be traveling on the train with him. And had a conversation with Sam, and Sam blows his mind, completely changes his life. And Harvey comes home and he's not drinking anymore. And after a short period of time, Harvey Firestone, the Firestone family says, Harvey, you know, what happened to you? Like, you seem to be doing really well. You're not drinking anymore. What's going on? So Harvey tells them, you know, I met these Oxford Group people and they changed my life. And the family says, you know, we're really rich. And who are these people? And, you know, we got to get them to come to town and introduce them to everybody, to all our friends. Like, this is a wonderful group. We got to promote them, you know. So the Oxford Group comes to Akron, Ohio. And the whole entire Oxford Group contingent takes up the whole entire Mayflower Hotel, which is later where Bill W. stayed when he first meets Dr. Bob. And now the Oxford Group comes to Akron, Ohio, and Dr. Bob, still drinking, comes in contact with the Oxford Group. The whole town came into contact with the Oxford Group because the Firestones were really, you know, promoting these people, and they kind of just took over the town for a period of time. And now, for the first time, Dr. Bob gets involved in the Oxford Group. Now, he still drank every day, but he gets involved in the Oxford Group, which is the same movement that Bill W. got involved in New York City. On the left there, sitting down, that's Frank Bookman. And on the right, you see an arrow of a guy that's also sitting down. That's Walter Tunks. These are articles about when the Oxford Group came to Akron for the first time. And Walter Tunks was the local minister that got really big on the Oxford Group. He was the main Oxford Group guy that you know, promoted the Oxford Group in Akron after the Oxford Group left. And this is the Mayflower. Like I said, the Oxford Group took over this whole entire hotel, which is a major coincidence because a few years later, this is where Bill W. stayed when he goes to Akron for the first time and ends up meeting Dr. Bob, the two co-founders. And this is the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel. And the big book talks about it that, you know, Bill's in the lobby and he's kind of pacing back and forth. And he's thinking, you know, I think I'm going to go into the bar and have a ginger ale. He was there on a business trip, and the business trip went really badly. And the people he went there with left. And he stayed to try to sort of rescue some money about the business opportunity, but the business deal went really, really bad, and Bill finds himself in a hotel, pacing back and forth in the lobby, depressed. He's sober, but he's depressed. And he's thinking, you know what? I think I'll go into the bar and have a ginger ale. Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And the cool thing is, in the big book, it says, God restored my sanity. And I realized that, I better find somebody to help. This goes sit in the bar and have ginger ale and make a friend. This is not a good idea. So he goes over to the church directory. And the town is filled with churches. How do you pick one? And he's looking at the names and he's looking at the churches. And he happens upon a church. And the minister's name is Reverend Walter Tunks. And in Vermont, they have these weird nicknames and these weird phrases. And in Vermont, a tunk is a walk in the woods. And Bill always loved walking in the woods. So he was like, wow, this is a really weird coincidence. I think I'll call this guy. Remember what I said earlier? Walter Tunks is the big Oxford Group promoter in Akron, Ohio. What are the odds of that? And what happened is, he calls Walter Tunks the day before Mother's Day, 1935. Now, to give you a little bit of a background, when Bill left New York to go to Akron on this business deal, Bill had been helping drunks for 6 months, and exactly 0 people got sober. And he got really depressed, and he got really down. And he went home one day after he went to visit Town's Hospital, once again not helping anybody. And he said to his wife, Lois, this doesn't seem to be working. I think I'm just going to give up. And Lois said, wait a minute. What do you mean it's not working? You've been sober for 6 months. That's never happened before. You better keep doing what you're doing because it's working for you. And just before he left to go to Akron, he was talking to Dr. Silkworth. And Dr. Silkworth said, Bill, do you mind if I give you some feedback? And Bill's like, yeah, it seems to me that what I'm doing isn't working. I would really love some feedback. And Dr. Silkworth says to Bill, Bill, you seem to be shoving this spiritual experience down people's throats. You need to start by reaching a drunk with the problem. And then after the drunk realizes that you know what you're talking about and that you once had the problem, then and only then do you start talking about the solution. You have to talk drunk to a drunk. You have to get them to identify that you once had the problem that they currently have, but that you don't have it anymore. And Bill said, thanks. Right away he leaves and he goes to Akron, Ohio. And the very first person he talks with that new information is Dr. Bob. And it works. So, Reverend Tunks gives Bill 10 phone numbers. And Bill goes over to the front desk and he gets a bunch of nickels and he starts putting nickels into the phone, and he calls one person, they can't help him, they call another person, they're leaving to go on vacation, they're not interested, they call another person. He calls all 10 people and all 10 people blow him off. Now my question to you is this: would you have made that 11th phone call? Because during those 10 phone calls, Bill talks to Norman Shepherd. And Norman Shepherd says, you know what, there's this doctor that has a drinking problem, and Henrietta Seiberling is trying to help him. Here's Henrietta Seiberling's phone number. Call her. I think she knows somebody that you can help. But Bill didn't want to call that phone number because Seiberling, which is Goodyear Tire, major corporation, headquarters in Akron, Ohio at the time, very, very rich family. Bill had business dealings with the Seiberling family, and he just didn't want to call them saying, I'm a drunk from New York and I'm looking for another drunk to help. Because as you know, that probably doesn't look good on a resume, if you understand what I'm talking about. So now Bill has one more phone number, and it's the only phone number he doesn't want to call. He throws that last nickel in the phone, and he makes that 11th phone call. And Henrietta picks up the phone. You see, weeks earlier, prior to this phone call, Henrietta organized a bunch of Oxford Group people to 12-step Dr. Bob. And a whole bunch of people showed up at Henrietta's house, and they set up Dr. Bob, basically. And Dr. Bob's wife brought Dr. Bob, and he's all hungover, and they're having this meeting. And what they decided to do, the technique that they were going to use was, make sure you talk about something big that's really wrong in your life, because we're going to try to get Dr. Bob to talk about his drinking. So we all need to share something risky. And they all do. They all go around and they all talk about, I cheated on my wife and I'm stealing from my work, and, this happened in my family. And they all go around and they share something really big and really risky about themselves. And everyone has shared now except for Bob. And they all just kind of look at Bob, they don't say anything, but they look at him like, your turn, you know what I mean? And Bob goes, you kind people have shared many interesting things. And I'm going to share something with you that I know that none of you know about. You see, I'm a secret drinker. I have a problem with alcohol. Now, they all knew about it. You know how we always think nobody knows about it, you know what I mean? They all knew about it. They were setting them up because of it. And finally, he opens up and admits that he has a problem with alcohol. And after Bob's done, somebody says, Bob, would you like us to pray with you? And Bob says, yeah, I would love that. So they all get on their knees and they say, God, please help Dr. Bob with his drinking problem. And then they go about their business. 2 or 3 weeks later, Henrietta Seiberling receives a call from Bill W. And Bill W. says, I'm a rum hound from New York and I'm looking for a drunk to help. I have a cure for alcoholism. And Henrietta Seiberling says to him, of course you are. We were expecting you. Please come right over. How weird is that? So Bill starts heading his way to Henrietta's house. Henrietta calls Dr. Bob's wife, Ann, and says, Ann, you're not going to believe it. Manna from heaven, God has provided. A man just called me from New York City. He says there's a cure for alcoholism. Drive Dr. Bob over right away. And Ann keeps coming up with these excuses about why they can't come over right now. They can't come over today. They can't come over. They can't come over. They can't come over. And Henrietta's like, Ann, why are you doing this? We prayed for help. God sent us help. Why aren't you bringing Bob right over? And Ann goes, well, I'm kind of embarrassed. It's the night before Mother's Day. Bob came home. He gave me a potted plant, and he's potted, passed out under the table, and I can't bring him anywhere. And Henrietta says, listen, that's not a problem. Bring him over tomorrow, Mother's Day, 1935. They do, and that's the first time that Bill and Bob meet. Now, just before Bob and his wife and his son get to Henrietta's house, Dr. Bob says, listen, I'm tired of talking to these people about my drinking. I'm only going to give them 15 minutes. And after 15 minutes are up, I want you to come into the room and say there's an emergency at the hospital and I need to leave because I'm out of here. I'm only giving them 15 minutes. And Ann's like, okay. They go to the house. They start to have dinner. Dr. Bob didn't feel like eating because his stomach was causing problems. And Bill could see that Dr. Bob was shaking and he was not having a very good moment. And Bill says, Bob, why don't we go talk in the library? And they leave the table and they go into the library and they end up talking for 6 hours. And when Dr. Bob left the room, Dr. Bob told his wife, this is the first guy I ever talked to that knew what he was talking about. Because he didn't talk to me about my drinking, he talked to me about his drinking. This is the first guy I ever talked to that knows what I'm going through because he went through it. And the two connect on a really deep level. Here's Henrietta Seiberling. This is her house where they met. This is the front of their house. There was the gate lodge. The main part of the house is way inland from the gate here. And then this is just the gate lodge where Henrietta lived with her kids. Because Henrietta's husband and her were kind of breaking up, so she wasn't with her husband anymore. And they were just at the gate lodge, sort of on the outskirts of the land where the Seiberlings lived. And this is the other side of the house. You can see a small roof on the right, on the lower part. That's where the library was. That was where Bill and Bob talked that first time. Now this is Dr. Bob on the left here. This is when he graduated from Rush University in Chicago. For those of you that don't know, Dr. Bob was a proctologist. He was a butt doctor. The other interesting thing about Dr. Bob was a lot of people said when they met Dr. Bob that he had really long fingers. And I'm sure that helped him in his work, right? You know what I mean? Sorry to have to mention that. And then that's his graduating class in Akron. That's Dr. Bob all the way to the right. And that's Ann Smith on the left. That's Dr. Bob's wife. That's Bob and Ann on the right with their dog Roger. They had a dog called Roger. Now, I really love this outfit on the left, but I don't know what kind of an occasion you would wear that to. And then this is Dr. Bob's two kids. That's Smitty on the left and Sue on the right. Smitty was natural born to Ann. After Ann gave birth to Smitty, she was not able to have children again. And Dr. Bob was an only child, and he didn't want to have an only child, so they adopted Sue. And this is Sue later in life, really wonderful lady. And this is Smitty, Dr. Bob's son, later in life. He became a pilot, and he lived down in Texas. Here's Bob and Ann. I love that tie. This is their house, 855 Ardmore Avenue in Akron, Ohio. Just like the Wilson House, I highly recommend that you go to Akron for Founders Day, second weekend of June every year. 15,000 people from all around the world. It's the greatest AA event that there is. The International is a really great event. I highly recommend that you go to the International, but the International is only every 5 years. Founders Day in Akron is every year. It's the most phenomenal event that exists in AA. I highly recommend it. And this is the kitchen in Dr. Bob's house. I'm sure a lot of one-on-one 12-step work activity occurred here. And this is upstairs in the bedroom. One of the Oxford group techniques that they would do in dealing with drunks was you would come into the house for the first time, and on the first floor, they would talk to you about your alcoholism, and they would see for themselves and for the drunk whether you were an alcoholic or not. So they would give them all a bunch of information and see if the person could identify. If you admitted that you had a problem, they would then say to you, do you believe in God? And the answer to that question was kind of important at the time, because if you didn't get upstairs. But if you did, you would go upstairs to the bedroom and they would go through steps 2 and 3 with you. What later became steps 2 and 3. And this is Dr. Bob's bedroom, and that's Dr. Bob's medicine bag when he used to go door to door whenever somebody needed help. Still today, you can go to this room and kneel and say the 3rd step prayer. I've seen people right in front of me have spiritual experiences. It's a really, really great experience. Now, this is one of the first letters, if not the first letter, that Bill writes home to his wife, Lois, because you see, Bill left New York and left his wife back in New York. And then like 3 or 4 months later, he still hadn't come back. So he would write letters and he would be in touch with her. And this is one of the first letters. You notice it says, "Darling, I am writing this in the office of one of my new friends, Dr. Smith. He has my trouble, which was alcoholism, and is getting to be a very ardent grouper, a very good Oxford grouper." And then it talks about, some of the work they're doing and stuff. This is one of the very first letters, May 1935, just after Bill meets Dr. Bob. And this is, again, to the right is the Mayflower Hotel. The building all the way to the left was where Dr. Bob's office was. Here's a cool action photo of Dr. Bob. Every year they would go to Minneapolis, Minnesota, and they would have these Founders Day gatherings, these Founders Day parties at a park. And this is one time when Dr. Bob went. I was told that Dr. Bob did not catch all these fish. Everybody that caught a fish gave it to Dr. Bob so he could pose for this photo. And you can see he was a heavy smoker. Ann never smoked. And Ann was Dr. Bob's wife. She never smoked. And then as soon as she started getting involved in alcoholics, she chain smoked for the rest of her life. Now this is where the first drunk squad of the Oxford group meetings were in Akron. This is at T. Henry and Clarice Williams' house. T. Henry and Cyrus Williams were not alcoholics, but they allowed their house to be used for the drunks of the Oxford group. So this is where the first AA meeting, basically. This is where the first pre-AA meeting ever took place. T. Henry and Cyrus Williams, also Akron, Ohio. And this is their living room. And this is T. Henry and Cyrus Williams, big supporters of early AA, but not alcoholics themselves. This is Akron City Hospital. Bill and Bob start going to Akron. This is where Dr. Bob worked, and this is where the first drunks in Akron start coming in to get sobered up. And this is where Bill D, AA number 3, gets 12-step by Bill and Dr. Bob. This is kind of a cool thing. This is Dr. Bob's prescription pad. Now, after Bob's been sober for a couple weeks, he remembers that the AMA convention is in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and that every year he always goes. But Dr. Bob's wife, Ann, remembers that he always drinks when he's there, and she doesn't think it's a good idea. But Dr. Bob really wants to go because, you know, you learn new things about medicine and stuff like that at these kind of conventions, and Bob really wanted to go, and he always went every year. And Bill said to Ann, you know, we can't chain him to the house, you know what I mean? Like, this is either going to work or it's not going to work. He needs to live his life. So Bob leaves and he goes to Atlantic City, and on the way to Atlantic City in New Jersey, he gets drunk, and he's wasted. Now, a lot of people say that June 10th, 1935 was Dr. Bob's sober date. It's pretty obvious by that picture that that's not possible, because you see the program on the left, it says the AMA convention was June 10th to the 14th, 1935. June 10th was a Monday, and June 14th was a Friday, so it was a week-long convention in Atlantic City, all week. And in Dr. Bob's story, he talks about being in Atlantic City Monday and Tuesday, and he's still drinking. And then he leaves to come home, and he's still drinking. And when he gets to Akron, Ohio, he doesn't call his wife. He calls his nurse from the hospital, and he's still drinking. And she takes him home, and she calls his wife and says, Dr. Bob just showed up. He's all wasted. Please come and pick him up. We're tired of dealing with him. And Ann and Bill go over, and they pick him up. And they sober him up for a few days. He has to do a really, really important operation. And on the way to the operation, they get to the hotel. Bill gives him his last beer and a couple pills. Bob goes in and does the operation. The operation is successful. Bill and Ann are waiting at home for Bob to return from the operation. They wait for hours and hours and hours, and Dr. Bob doesn't come home. And Bill's afraid that the beer that he gave him set off the craving and Bob's drinking again. And then finally, late at night, Bob comes home. And Ann says, where were you? And Bob says, I was out making amends. Because you see, up until this point, there were two things that were very Oxford group that later became AA that Bob was not willing to do. One of them was he didn't think it was important to work with people because he just wasn't a social, friendly kind of guy. And the second thing was he didn't want to have to go and make amends because he was a proctologist who depends on referrals, and it's not a good idea to go around telling people that I'm a heavy drinker. That's not good for business. But now, after Dr. Bob relapsed and realized, you know, I'm only doing some of this, I'm not doing all of it, now I'm going to do all of it, he starts to go around making amends, and he also starts going around to help people. The two things he wasn't willing to do. Now he's doing the whole program instead of his program. He never drinks again until the day of his death. This is AA number 3, Bill D. This is Bill and Dr. Bob's daughter, Sue. This is Ernie G. He became AA number 4. In the big book, they refer to him as the devil may care chap. This was one of the first young people in AA. He was in his 30s. Most of the people were older than that. So this is the first young person, basically. And what happened was, and I love this story, what happened was Dr. Bob's daughter, Sue, had a boyfriend, Ray Windows. And Dr. Bob didn't particularly like him. So what Dr. Bob did was, he said to Ernie, he said, Ernie, why don't you come over and talk to my daughter and, kind of distract her away from her boyfriend. But what Dr. Bob didn't anticipate, he just wanted him to talk to him. He didn't want him to fall in love with her. And what happened was, Ernie and Sue fall in love and they decide to get married. And Dr. Bob didn't like Ray for his daughter, and he really, really didn't like Ernie for his daughter, because he had listened to Ernie's fifth step, and you don't want a person like that dating your daughter, if you understand what I'm talking about. So Ernie and Sue get married, and Dr. Bob and his wife do not go to the wedding. This was back in the day, this is a very different time than it is now. Now, some people ask, who was the first woman to get and stay sober? Well, that's this woman, Sylvia Kaufman. She was the first woman to get and stay sober. Now, the first woman that ever came to AA was Florence Rankin. She didn't stay sober very long, and then she died of alcoholism in Baltimore. Now, a lot of people say that Marty Mann was the first woman to come and get sober. But a book came out about her after she died, and there's some suggestion that a couple years after she got sober, she drank a few times. So she can't be the person that got sober and stayed sober first. So for my money, that's this woman, Sylvia K. Dr. Bob was her sponsor. This is the second woman, Ethel M. Second woman to get and stay sober. Dr. Bob was her sponsor. And then the Oxford Group meetings were in the Williams house, and then the meetings got too big. So then the meetings used to be in Dr. Bob's house. And then for the first time, there's an AA meeting outside of a home. For those of you that don't know them, that's where the expression home group comes from, because all the meetings were in people's homes. And this is the first place, the King School meeting, the first place to have an AA meeting outside of a home, Akron, Ohio. Another cool picture of Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob, Earl T., who was the founder in Illinois, and Barry C., who was the founder in Minnesota. Hank P., finally after a few months, Bill goes back home to New York, and he sobers up Hank P. Hank P. is the guy that brought AA to New Jersey. Hank P.'s office is where the big book was written, in Newark, New Jersey. Hank P. was a red-headed, fiery kind of guy. If Bill Wilson was a wheeler-dealer, Hank P. was a super wheeler-dealer. If it wasn't for Hank, the big book would have never came out. And this is where his office was, in Newark, New Jersey, 17 William Street. The building is still there. They gutted it, and this is what it looks like today. And you notice by the door to the left, there's a little plaque. And this is what the plaque reads. That it was at this place that the first AA headquarters was, and it was at this place is where the big book was written. This all just happened this year. This plaque was just put there this year. And these are the early writings in that building of AA. It's a chapter that was never put into the big book called The Strange Obsession. This was the desk where the big book was written. This was Hank's desk, and Ruth Hock was the secretary, and she was the one that typed it. And these are just some early versions of the steps. This is the 6 tenets of the Oxford Group. Notice on the left it says, admitted hopeless, got honest with self, got honest with another, made amends, help others without demands, prayed to God as you understand Him. These are the 6 tenets of the Oxford Group that later became the 12 steps. This is just another version of the early steps. This is the original Dr. Silkworth letter that's at the opening part of the doctor's opinion. This is Ruth Hock. She's the one that typed the big book. They still have the typewriter at the GSO office in New York City. It is the most rinky-dink looking typewriter I've ever seen. I can't believe anything was written on, let alone something of substance. And this is Ruth with Bill sitting at the table where Bill first met Ebbie. What they did in the beginning to raise money to be able to put out the big book was they sold stock certificates to raise money to be able to get the big book out. Now, what's interesting about the stock certificates is that they never registered the stock. which means that they were selling illegal stocks for their spiritual book. Now tell me that's not alcoholic. That's a proud moment as far as I'm concerned. This is their best thinking, right? This is their... Now this is the greatest photo of AA history I've ever seen. The guy on the bottom right is Herbert Taylor. He was the guy that signed the certificate. He was the president of AA. His name is under the president of AA. Top right is Dr. Bob. To the left of him is Ann, his wife, chain smoking, right? And then above her is Jimmy B. He's the guy that suggested, instead of God as you understand him, which was a very important suggestion. Also, he's the one that brought AA to Pennsylvania. He's your founder of Pennsylvania. He started AA in Philadelphia. To the left of him is Ruth Hawk. She's the one that typed the big book. You got Crystal and Horace C., who are members of AA. You got Bill Wilson, and then you got Ann Wilson, or Lois Wilson on the left. Now, this is the greatest photo of AA history as far as I'm concerned, but I have no idea. Whose idea was it to get dressed up and sit in the dirt? I have absolutely no idea. And then this is Jimmy B. Like I said, he's your founder. He started AA in Philadelphia. He's also referred to in the 12 and 12 as the atheist. This is what the big book looked like when it first came out, and that's a proposed big book cover. I really love the cover on the right. I really would love to get a copy of that and put it on my book. You'll notice the bottle in the background. On the bottom, there's a guy lost in the bottom of the bottle, stuck in alcoholism, and a pathway to a cure. And then this is Clarence S. He's my favorite guy in AA history. He started getting Plain, he was from Cleveland, Dr. Bob was his sponsor, and he started having articles written in the Plain Dealer, which was the local newspaper, and he was more successful with more drunks in the first few years of his sobriety than Bill and Dr. Bob combined. This guy was the perfect combination of Dr. Bob, who had a really strong program ethic, but not much of a promoter, and Bill, who was a major promoter, but not such a strong program ethic, and Clarence was the combination of the two. He helped so many people in Cleveland that most people thought that AA started in Cleveland, and coincidentally, our first international convention was in Cleveland because most of the people were there already. And then AA is about to die. AA is about to die. We can't raise money for the book. We can't raise money to keep the office open. And John Rockefeller, who we talked to originally to help us, is keeping an eye on us. And he's noticing that AA is not doing well. All the efforts of the AAs were bringing about AA dying. All our promoting and all our actions brought nothing. And John Rockefeller noticed we weren't doing well, and he decided to have a dinner with all of his friends, all of his rich friends. And this is an invitation to that dinner. It was February 8th, 1940. And the AAs thought that they were going to be able to raise a lot of money because of all these rich people that were there. And at the end of the dinner, John Rockefeller's son, Nelson Rockefeller, gets up and says, "Good friends, we feel that AA is a great movement and it's worth our support, but please do not give them any money. If we give them money, it'll probably ruin this thing." And then all the rich people leave. And the AAs are like, what the heck? And some of them did give us some money, and even John Rockefeller gave us some money, but it was a very small amount, and we were just barely able to stay alive. We were about to die. We were about to go the way of all the other movements that tried to help drunks. This is an article about the dinner. This is a list of a whole lot of members and where all the meetings were at the time. You can see, let's see, Philadelphia, 75 members. That's the only one on there. That's Pennsylvania. There's another picture of Clarence. Does anybody know where the first 3 meetings outside of North America were? The first 3 meetings outside of North America. Everybody always says Canada. Canada's North America. The first meeting is in Australia. The second one is Bermuda. And the third one is Ireland. You knew it had to get to Ireland quick, right? I mean, here's a picture of Bill and Lois. This is Sister Ignatia. She's the one that helped the drunks in Akron. She used to give out these St. Ignatia badges. This is where this is the precursor of the coins that we have in the rooms. They moved from Akron City Hospital to St. Thomas Hospital, and now Dr. Bob's working here helping drunks. Cool picture of Bill and Bob. And then, the results of the alcoholics amounted to nothing. We were about to die. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere in 1941, this man, Jack Alexander, was a well-known writer. He had just revealed that the mafia was in Atlantic City. Who didn't know that? He was a muckraker. He was a guy that exposed movements. And his next job was Alcoholics Anonymous. He was hired to expose us as a fraud. He comes to New York City and he meets with Bill. And Bill says to him, Jack, we know why you're here. We don't have any problem with what you're doing. But we would like to ask you a few things. One, here's a list of every meeting that we're aware of. 2, go to at least 10 meetings before you write your article. And then after 10 meetings, just do what you feel you should do. And Jack's like, you mean you're not going to set me up with a bunch of people and you're not going to set me up with meetings and you're not going to... And Bill's like, no, if we do that, you're going to know we're a fraud. We're not setting up anything. We're giving you all the meetings. Don't tell anybody who you are or what you're doing. Just go to at least 10 meetings and then write your article. Have a nice day. And Jack Alexander goes around to meetings in New York City, Akron, New Jersey, Philadelphia, and he is blown away by AA. And he writes this glowing article in the Saturday Evening Post, one of the biggest magazines of the time, about how great AA is. And all of a sudden, AA explodes onto the scene, and then it starts to be nationwide, and AA explodes. And we go from about 2,000 members earlier in 1941 to 8,000 members later in 1941. That would be as if, let's say your home group has 50 people. Within a few months, now all of a sudden your home group has 200 people. All of a sudden every group just explodes. AA becomes a national movement. Jack Alexander saved our ass. Prior to this, AA was going to die. Because of Jack Alexander and his article, AA becomes an American supported movement, and AA has thrived ever since then. Here's the magazine article on the left, and that's a picture that's in the magazine article. That's sort of a mock picture of a meeting. It's not an actual meeting, it's just they wanted to take a picture, so they just sat in a circle. Somebody took a picture of a typical meeting. And for some reason, coffee has become a big part of AA, right? It's like, I always find that interesting. I don't drink coffee and I don't smoke cigarettes. And some of my friends say, Bill, we don't think you're an alcoholic. And then ultimately, as far as I'm concerned, and this is the last slide, ultimately AA is about one-on-one, helping one drunk, helping another. We don't help alcoholics because they're sick. We help alcoholics because we're sick, and we need to be helping alcoholics. We shouldn't at a meeting just give somebody our phone number. We should also get their phone number and call them and introduce them to people and bring them around to meetings and then give them a chance on whether they want the program. An alcoholic that's new to AA has probably not made very good decisions lately, and now they come to AA and we're expecting them to make a good decision by calling a bunch of people they don't even know. In early AA, that was backwards. We help people because we're sick. We don't necessarily help people because they're sick. Thanks for letting me share.
Let's thank Bill one more time for starting us out here. Can you guys take like a really quick 5-minute, wow, there's a lot of people here. can you take like a quick 5-minute break, maybe a 10-minute at the max, and then let's get started, because Richie wants to come up here. He's got a lot of stuff and a lot of energy to share, and so thanks for coming out, and we'll start again in 10 minutes. 7 and a half.